Now, one characteristic of Hegel's thought, which you've made very clear, is that he always sees ideas not just as existing in the abstract, and certainly not being timeless and unchanging in the way that, say, Plato saw them, but as being embodied in societies and institutions and historical realities which change.
The opening question that's posed by the presuppositional model of apologetics is actually in itself extremely interesting. Is it impossible for God to exist? Most of Sai's more intelligent opponents will go with what looks at first blush like the most challenging reply to this question. They'll ask exactly what he means by the word God. It's not a bad question, honestly, but it's one that he comes prepared for with a list of attributes that he reads off and closes the inquiry as quickly as possible by doubling down on the question. I want to suggest here, however, that the definition of God is not actually what's interesting. The question always looked odd to me. Is it impossible for God to exist? It took me a while, but with a bit of thought, I think I finally put my finger on it.
Before we get going, let me ask, you claim to be an atheist, is that correct?
Yes, I am an atheist.
Okay, and now are you saying that it's impossible for God to exist, or you just lack belief in God?
Well, that question is actually very problematic because what do you mean by God, basically?
You don't know. God is the creator and sustainer of the universe.
Okay, so what properties does she or he have?
Look, I'm not going to get into definitions with you. You know what we mean as the Christian God.
Okay, then yes, it's impossible.
You said you have a lot of family that are fundamental Christians. Surely you know our definition of God.
The question here is, what could this question mean? What is being asked here, and how does it frame the debate? The atheists on YouTube have, I think, made a subtle mistake in interpretation here. The question, is it impossible for God to exist, is not, do you believe that God exists, or do you necessarily disbelieve? The actual question posed is similar to those, but it's slightly displaced, and bringing that slight displacement to light is the goal here. First, notice that the question isn't in the second person. There is no you in the question, is it impossible for God to exist? This is a nice rhetorical trap. If I were to ask, do you believe it's impossible to exist? I'm clearly asking you about your beliefs, entailed in which is a soberly implicit admission of subjective fallibility. In other words, I'm clearly asking you for your subjective assessment of the matter. On the other hand, the question, is it impossible for God to exist, is much more dangerous, as it's not asking you for a subjective assessment, it's inviting you to make an unqualified absolute statement. If I say, it is impossible for God to exist, the implication is quite different than if I say something like, given what I understand about reality, I find it to be unlikely. The former is a proposition about reality as such. The latter is a proposition about my subjective beliefs. It seems to me that YouTube atheists tend to answer as if it's a question about their beliefs, and then are baffled when they're scrutinized as though they made a knowledge claim.
Yes, and that God does not exist. It's impossible for it to exist because it's logically contradictory.
Okay, so you believe in logical absolutes then?
Consider the use of the word impossible in this context. What function does this word play in the proposition, it is impossible for X to exist? It seems to me that when translated into clearer language, the statement becomes something like, we have this thing called existence, which is defined by some criteria, which likely takes the form of some set of necessary and sufficient conditions. There are then three possibilities. When something conforms to that criteria, it may be said to exist. Without going into what that criteria might be, I think it's uncontroversial that the lighter in my hand, for instance, exists. A second tier in this hierarchy might be something that doesn't meet that criteria, but is consistent with it. Take my neighbor's bicycle. I don't know if my neighbor actually has a bicycle, but it's certainly not an impossibility. That is, this hypothetical object hasn't met this criteria, but it's perfectly consistent with it. The third category would be things that are actually in contradiction to whatever criteria defines existence. Square circles, for instance. So the question may be restated as, does God fall into the second or third category? What I want to draw attention to is a kind of rhetorical contradiction concerning the word impossible. Saying that X is impossible sounds like an absolute claim. That is, a claim without qualification. But it's actually not that at all. The word impossible here is being invoked with respect to some notion of existence, or a criteria by which it is defined. It is not that X is impossible in all contexts, but rather, relative to some notion of existence, X is impossible. He is asking you a question that sounds absolute, but is actually extremely contingent. Rest assured, however, that your answer will be taken as an absolute if you say no, it is not possible for God to exist. The next question is, then you believe in absolutes? But this clearly isn't an absolute claim. It's a claim made with respect to some structure of propositions about reality. And this brings me to my third point. Implicit in the question, is it impossible for God to exist, is the assumption that you actually have a detailed, precise, and even proven framework in regards to the question, what is existence? Or if you want to put it philosophically, what is being? The field of inquiry that's traditionally organized around this question is called ontology, and it's quite literally the most deep and mysterious of all philosophical questions. There have even been good reasons provided to suspect that this field may be impossible to come to any real insight in, as there are some extremely tall epistemic hurdles to jump before you can get there. The question, however, puts the person answering it into the position of someone who is claiming to have solved the question of being, which again is possibly an unsolvable question. Throughout this interrogation, the presuppositionalist will consistently emphasize the word knowledge, which leads people to believe that this is a conversation about epistemology. In fact, most of the atheist responses to presuppositionalism amount to discussions about epistemology. I submit to you that this is a red herring. It is impossible for God to exist, or is it impossible for God to exist, is not an epistemic question. It's an ontological question, and answering yes or no is to give your permission to be put in a situation where you have to tackle the hardest questions of philosophy on the fly. It's like a first-year math student 30 years ago consenting to defending his proof of Fermat's last theorem. First, the proof didn't exist, and second, even if it did, she likely wouldn't have been able to talk intelligently about it. For any presuppositionalist watching, this isn't a concession. You tell me your answer to the question, what is being? That is, define for me the conditions by which something can be said to exist. I'd be happy to have a conversation where you have to demonstrate the truth of some ontology. It should be noted as well that posing the question in this way simply assumes that the atheist has or requires one unified, perfectly consistent view that totalizes all of reality. Presuppers will use this term worldview as a way of smuggling in this assumption. I want to posit here that this is a claim about human cognition and discourse. I would reject out of hand that the notion of discrete, consistent, self-identical worldviews is a good model for discussing how the human subject constructs her perspectives. It seems to me that how we actually approach things is a much more piecemeal and pragmatic way. Quantum theory works amazingly well. Relativity works amazingly well. These two models, however, are mutually exclusive. The moment that you're willing to affirm both, even if you assume that the contradiction between them points to the existence of a higher theory of everything, your worldview is inconsistent. That is, you are capable of occupying more than one mutually exclusive perspectives when the situation calls for it. One way to actually describe the history of knowledge is to look at it as a history of synthesizing mutually exclusive claims. As such, it can be said that in the real world, knowledge is always something partial, incomplete, and inconsistent. What we have here is two different models of how knowledge actually functions. The presuppositionalist assumes that knowledge begins with the totalizing picture of the world and is essentially analytic. That is, it is about carving the pre-given whole into parts. I, on the other hand, think that this is getting the cart before the horse. We learn about parts, or particulars, and we synthesize wholes or universals out of that inquiry. This seems to me to be a much more accurate reflection of how virtually all modes of discourse function. Before we had evolution, we studied taxonomy. The study of the parts led to the whole. If this is how knowledge functions, then it's the person who makes the claim to the absolute who is effectively disavowing knowledge in favor of an abstract, anti-epistemic purism. Real knowledge comes from getting one's hands dirty, rather than standing at a distance and applying abstract categories, which is, of course, the way in which the Cyclones used the slogan "Justified True Belief" to delegitimize empirical engagement with the world. I don't claim to have one grand perspective that stitches together all aspects of reality into a perfectly consistent system, and there's no reason that I should have to, but when someone asks me about my worldview, quote unquote, is it not the case that I'm being talked to as if I had in fact made that claim?
Hegel saw the society of pure reason as typified by the kind of thing that the French revolutionaries wanted to do. You know, they didn't just get rid of the king and the nobles and of religion, but they tried to make everything rational. They said, why have months of irregular days? Why not make them all the same number of days? Why have weeks of 7 days? Let's make them 10, like our decimal system of measurement, and so on. Now, Hegel saw that as leading to a kind of madly abstract notion of reason, rather like, for instance, the view of a town planner who might look at a map of London and say, oh, well, your streets all run crooked and traffic has to make detours and so on. Let's get rid of this. Let's tear all the buildings down, make nice straight streets. In each block we'll put a big high-rise apartment. We can fit more people in. You can have a smooth green lawn outside for the children to play, and it'll all be beautiful and ordered and rational.
Well, we've actually had that in London, and it's been catastrophic.
That's right. And Hegel would have predicted that it would have been catastrophic because it was abstract reason taken to an extreme.